I think when you give kids information, information is power. And so when I was concerned, I used to get the real newspaper, right, that would show up on our doorstep every day. And if I was reading the newspaper and I found an article that made me go, ooh, that's an important thing my kids should know about, I would just hand it to them and say, sometime today, could you read this article? And we don't have to talk about it a lot, but I'd just like to know one or two takeaways that you have just to kind of show me that you read it. And then I promise we won't talk about it again.
Now we're going back into the teenagers and screen time. I bet lots of parents are interested in learning about managing screen time and curfews. So what are some of the effective strategies you can share from your experience as a parent to monitor and limit their teenager screen time and online activities without causing severe conflict? So still being that connected piece in.
Right. And I think we make a mistake if we expect there to be no conflict. Whenever you have more than one human being together in the same room and in the same family for an extended period, there's going to be conflict. It's just unavoidable. So what I appreciate about positive discipline is it gives us the tools for managing the conflict as productively as we can and for the hopefully best results of everybody involved.
Eva, let's talk about managing screen time or curfew. I know parents have this topic that happens as soon as our children get into the middle school and high school age. So what are effective strategies that parents can use to monitor and limit teenager screen time? Probably we have to limit ours first, I'm sure. Right. And online activities without causing severe conflicts.
Well, I think that comes down to a couple of things. It's being aware ourselves of how much our kids are on screens, because it seems like even when they're at school, so many schools that I'm aware of have individual computers that each kid has that they carry from class to class. And so they're doing so much of their learning online throughout the day. And most kids by the teenage years have a phone. And then there's the iPads and the everything else that's involved in our lives. And then we parents, like you said, are using screens so much of the day that we need to be aware of our own use and aware of our kids' use. So I think there are a lot of ways to approach this. And again, creative problem solving with our kids, and then also some hard boundaries. But I think when you give kids information is power. And so when I was concerned, I used to get the real newspaper, right, that would show up on our doorstep every day. And if I was reading the newspaper and I found an article that made me go, ooh, that's an important thing my kids should know about, I would just hand it to them and say, sometime today, could you read this article? And we don't have to talk about it a lot, but I'd just like to know one or two takeaways that you have just to kind of show me that you read it. And then I promise we won't talk about it again. And then as we moved more online, my news is online now, but you can still do things like that. So I think around screen time, it's really important to have kids understand why. I'm not just being a dictator and telling you because I think so. The research says too much time on screens is bad for your developing brain for a lot of reasons. That you play video games and you're online with social media and all those things, and our brain is using artificial external means of getting motivation for dopamine to be released. And dopamine is a pleasure chemical in our brain. So when we use all these external technological means of getting our brains to release dopamine so that we feel good, then over time, it's harder and harder for the brain to produce its own dopamine without that stimulation. And really where kids should be getting their dopamine is from real interactions with real people in real time, from doing things like playing a more physical game, a more tactile game and doing well, or cooking something like you said, or doing an activity and doing it well and taking pleasure from it. Those also help our brain produce dopamine. And we need to give our kids more natural, organic ways to experience that, because it's not them that's experiencing it, it's the brain operating. So when we can help kids understand that, I'm not just being a dictator. There's a real scientific-based reason for this. Let's do research together. So this wasn't quite as much of an issue for my kids because they were hitting teenage era, just as social media was starting to explode. So I didn't feel like it was as big an issue for us when they were that age as it is now for parents. And I really have empathy for how difficult this is to navigate. So having kids do the research and parents do the research and come together and talk about what we've learned. There are lots of resources for kids to find out, what does this kind of an activity do with or to my developing brain? How does that impact my ability in other areas? So coming at it from the science and then looking at it and saying there are boundaries to this. So the recommendation is that kids your age should have X amount of screen time per day, okay, from 5 o'clock when you get home from school until 10 o'clock when you go to bed. Here's how much time can be allotted for that. How do you choose to use it? And so when we give kids limited choices within boundaries, so here's the boundary. You can have 1 hour of screen time between here and here. How do you choose to use it? If it's texting your friends, fine. If it's watching videos on YouTube, okay. And when your hour is up, your hour is up. And then what are we going to do with the technology, and what else could you do with your time? And it's okay with me if you sit on the sofa and you're bored out of your mind, because boredom is often a seed that we plant for creativity. So I think we, in my generation of parents, have become too focused on making sure our kids are busy all the time. Sitting still and just being is an opportunity for kids to be thinking and reflecting and coming up with creative ideas about what else they could do if they're so bored that they need to get off the couch and do it, right? Get outside and do something in nature. Call a friend and go for a walk or whatever. So I think when we set boundaries and then give choices within those boundaries and create solutions, that's the formula that we can use to navigate not just screen time, but a lot of other issues as well. Does that make sense?
So much so. And I was just thinking as you were speaking about the when they're bored. All right. So what are 5 things that we can do? Not when they're bored, but maybe having that conversation, because you were talking about these conversations that lead to when the time comes, they can problem solve together or independently. We have this technology. When do you want to use it? And what type of information I feel comfortable for you to be using, to have access to.
Right.
I don't, as a parent, these are non-negotiables. And from this, I'd like you to choose, and I want you to be part of this decision making. And when you don't have technology, and if you're bored, what are other things that we can do? And when there is that including, hey, you're helping me with the cooking, or you're helping walk a dog, or whatever that might be, they already have other things to fill their time with. Whereas they no longer need that social media all the time, because there are breaks that we're giving them automatically that takes them away. And I think it's really, like you mentioned, having those agreements up front. And when children are part of that agreement making, chances are they're going to hold on to them. Because when children make these agreements, and I have this great story about my daughter when she was younger, we had talked about ice cream and when to have ice cream. And she decided with her sister that Friday night and Saturday night, they were going to have certain desserts. And during the week, we would have fruits. One Wednesday morning, she marches downstairs and she's just saying, and of course, I'm preparing dinner. I'm about to serve it. And she says, I think I want ice cream. And she had so much sass to her. And I said, all right, what day is today? And she said, it's Wednesday. I want ice cream. And I said, well, what do you think? Would you like to eat ice cream? And she was like, no, you tell me that I can eat the ice cream. And I said, well, you know the agreement, you can decide. And she basically was, no, you need to decide. And I knew in that moment, she did not want to break the agreement she had made, but she would like me to break it.
Right.
So sometimes with children, I mean, when she was 9, 10, 11, all these types of things were even more, prevalent. But we stuck to the agreements and we said, you can have the ice cream if you choose that you don't, want to break the agreements. And I think these types of conversations when we have with our children, that follow through piece is the most important ones. And I think when they're throwing a tantrum or when they're angry and they're just depending on our personality and time we have with them, sometimes we get hijacked with emotions of guilt and wanting to give in. And it unfortunately backfires as they get older.
Right.
So boundaries, I love that agreements and then following through on whatever we create as a guideline.